I was standing in my kitchen making breakfast when the doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession, which was my first clue that something unpleasant was about to happen. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with Patricia Henderson, the president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. She stood there with her arms crossed, her face pinched into that expression that told me she'd been rehearsing whatever speech she was about to deliver. Patricia was somewhere in her mid-50s, with a short blonde bob that looked like it had been styled with a ruler and wearing a crisp white blouse that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Mr. Johnson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss the noise complaints that have been filed against you." I blinked, genuinely confused. "Noise complaints? What are you talking about?" She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her designer handbag and thrust it toward me. "I've received multiple reports about excessive noise coming from your residence at all hours. Loud music, stomping, banging. It's disturbing the peace of our community, and it needs to stop immediately." I took the paper and scanned it. There were 3 complaints listed, all from the past 2 weeks, all claiming that my townhouse was generating unreasonable noise between the hours of 7 in the evening and 11 at night. The thing was, I worked as a software developer from home, and my evenings typically consisted of reading, watching television at a moderate volume, or occasionally playing video games with headphones on. I wasn't throwing parties or blasting music. "Patricia, I think there's been some mistake. I'm not making excessive noise. I'm pretty quiet, actually." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you calling me a liar?" "No, I'm saying that whoever filed these complaints might be confused about where the noise is coming from. Have you checked with the other neighbors?" "The complaints are legitimate, and they specifically mention your address. Under the HOA bylaws, Section 12, subsection 4, residents are prohibited from creating noise disturbances that interfere with the reasonable enjoyment of neighboring properties. I'm giving you a formal warning. If we receive any more complaints, there will be fines." I felt my jaw tighten. "I'd like to see proof of these noise violations before you start threatening me with fines." Patricia's face flushed red. "The resident complaints are proof enough. You have been warned, Mr. Johnson." She turned on her heel and marched back down my walkway. I closed the door and looked at the paper again. This didn't make any sense. I lived in a corner unit, which meant I only had one shared wall with my neighbor on the left side. That neighbor was an elderly man named Frank, who had spoken with maybe twice since moving in 8 months ago, and he'd always been friendly. He didn't strike me as the type to file noise complaints, especially since I'd never heard a peep from his side either. That evening I decided to do some investigating. I walked over to Frank's place and knocked on his door. He answered after a moment, looking pleasantly surprised to see me. "Derek, isn't it?" he asked, opening the screen door. "What can I do for you?" "Hey Frank, quick question. Have you been experiencing any noise issues from my place? Music, loud sounds, anything like that?" Frank looked genuinely puzzled. "Noise from you? No, not at all. I barely know you're there, to be honest. Why do you ask?" "The HOA just came by saying there have been multiple noise complaints filed against me. I wanted to make sure it wasn't you before I started digging deeper." Frank shook his head. "Definitely not me. That's strange. Your place is quiet as a mouse from what I can tell." He paused, then lowered his voice. "Although I will say that Patricia's place right behind yours can get pretty loud sometimes. I hear it from my back patio. Lots of yelling, television volume way up. But I mind my own business, you know." That was interesting. Patricia's townhouse backed up to mine. Our rear patios were separated by maybe 30 feet and a small wooden fence. We didn't share any walls, but sound could certainly travel between our outdoor spaces and through windows. Thanks, Frank. I appreciate the honesty. No problem. And hey, if Patricia is giving you trouble, just know she's done this kind of thing before. She's very particular about the neighborhood. I went back to my place thinking about what Frank had said. The next evening, around 8 o'clock, I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard it. Loud voices, almost shouting, coming from somewhere behind my townhouse. I got up and walked to my back sliding door. The sound was definitely coming from Patricia's place. I could hear a television blaring what sounded like a reality show, and a woman's voice, Patricia's voice, yelling along with it. The volume was significant enough that I could make out actual words. An idea formed in my mind. If Patricia was going to accuse me of noise violations, maybe I needed to document what was actually happening. I went to my computer and started researching decibel meters. After reading reviews for about an hour, I ordered a professional-grade sound level meter, the kind that could record data over time and produce detailed reports. It cost me $200, but if Patricia was going to escalate this situation, I wanted evidence. The meter arrived 3 days later. It was a sleek device with a digital display and the ability to connect to my computer for data logging. I spent an evening reading the manual and learning how to use it properly. The device could measure sound levels in a weighted decibels, which is the standard measurement for environmental noise and what most city noise ordinances reference. I set up a monitoring schedule. Every evening from 6 p.m. to midnight, I'd take regular readings from different locations in my townhouse. I placed the meter in my living room, my bedroom, and near the back patio door. I also made notes about what I was doing at the time of each reading. Watching TV at normal volume registered around 45 to 50 decibels. Having a conversation on the phone was about 55. Even when I played music through my speakers at what I considered a comfortable listening level, the meter showed readings between 55 and 60 decibels. For comparison, I also took readings of the noise coming from Patricia's place. Standing on my back patio when I could hear her television through her open windows, the meter registered between 65 and 70 decibels. When she was yelling, which seemed to happen frequently, the reading spiked to 75 decibels or higher. I documented everything meticulously for 2 weeks. I had spreadsheets, graphs, and time-stamped recordings. The data clearly showed that my typical evening noise levels were well within reasonable limits, while the noise emanating from Patricia's townhouse regularly exceeded what most municipalities would consider acceptable for a residential area. Then, I received the letter. It came by certified mail, which meant I had to sign for it. The envelope had the HOA's return address embossed in raised lettering. Inside was a formal notice stating that I was being fined $500 for ongoing noise violations, and that if the behavior continued, the fines would increase and could eventually result in legal action. I called the HOA office immediately. A woman named Susan answered. "This is Derek Johnson at 847 Meadowbrook Way. I just received a fine notice for noise violations, and I need to dispute this." "Let me pull up your file," Susan said. I heard typing in the background. "Okay, yes, Mr. Johnson." The fine was issued by Patricia Henderson, our HOA president, based on multiple documented complaints. I'd like to see these complaints, who filed them, and what evidence was provided. I'm not at liberty to disclose the names of residents who file complaints. That information is kept confidential to protect them from retaliation. "That's convenient," I said, unable to keep the frustration from my voice. "So someone can make anonymous accusations and I'm just supposed to accept a fine without any actual proof. The complaints are documented in our system, Mr. Johnson. That constitutes proof. Documentation of a complaint isn't the same as proof that the complaint is valid. I've been measuring sound levels at my residence for the past 2 weeks, and I can definitively prove that I'm not creating noise disturbances. There was a pause. You'll need to submit that information in writing to the HOA board. We meet on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. Fine. When's the next meeting? That would be next week, Tuesday at 7 p.m., but you'll need to request to be added to the agenda at least 48 hours in advance. I sent an email that same day requesting to present my evidence at the board meeting. I also refused to pay the $500 fine and stated in writing that I would be contesting it. The week leading up to the meeting, I continued my monitoring. I also did something else. I reached out to my other neighbors to ask if they'd experienced any noise issues. I spoke with the family across the street, the couple 2 doors down, and several other residents I'd seen around the neighborhood. Not a single person reported hearing excessive noise from my townhouse. In fact, several people mentioned that they barely knew I was there. What I did learn was that Patricia had a reputation. 3 different neighbors told me stories about her aggressive enforcement of HOA rules, often targeting people for minor infractions, while seemingly ignoring similar issues with properties owned by her friends. One neighbor, a woman named Jennifer, told me that Patricia had fined her $200 for having a garden gnome in her front yard that exceeded the permitted decorative item height by 3 inches. Tuesday evening arrived, and I showed up at the HOA meeting held in the community center near the neighborhood entrance. I brought my laptop, my sound meter, and a folder full of printed documentation. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the board members sat and rows of chairs for residents. There were maybe a dozen other people in attendance. Patricia sat in the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other board members I recognized from around the neighborhood. She saw me walk in and her expression hardened. The meeting started with standard business, approval of previous meeting minutes, budget discussions, and updates on neighborhood landscaping projects. After about 30 minutes, Patricia called for new business and resident concerns. "We have Derek Johnson here to discuss his noise violation fine," she said, her tone making it clear she considered this a waste of time. I stood up and moved to the front of the room. "Thank you for allowing me to present. I'm here because I've been accused of creating noise disturbances and fined $500. However, I have substantial evidence that proves these accusations are false." I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector they had set up. I pulled up my spreadsheet showing 2 weeks of sound level data. "This is a professional-grade sound level meter," I said, holding up the device. "It measures sound in a weighted decibels, which is the standard used for environmental noise assessment. I've been taking regular measurements of sound levels in my townhouse every evening for the past 2 weeks. I walked them through the data. As you can see, my typical evening sound levels range from 40 to 60 decibels. For context, normal conversation is about 60 decibels. A quiet library is about 40. City noise ordinances typically set limits at 65 to 70 decibels during evening hours. I'm well below those thresholds." One of the board members, a man in his 60s, leaned forward. "That's all very interesting, Mr. Johnson, but the complaints state that the noise occurs late at night. Do you have readings from those times?" "I do." I switched to another sheet showing nighttime data. Between 10 p.m. and midnight, my sound levels average between 35 and 45 decibels. That's essentially ambient noise. There's no way that level of sound would disturb anyone. Patricia spoke up, her voice sharp. You could have easily manipulated this data or taken these readings on nights when you were intentionally quiet. This proves nothing. Actually, it proves quite a bit, I responded. These readings were taken continuously over a 2-week period, including every single evening when complaints were supposedly filed. The data logger timestamps every measurement. I pulled up the raw data file showing the timestamps, but here's the really interesting part. I switched to a different graph. I also took measurements of the noise coming from other properties in the neighborhood, specifically from the townhouse directly behind mine. I didn't say Patricia's name, but everyone in the room knew which property I was talking about. The sound levels from that location regularly exceeded 70 decibels, with spikes up to 75 and 80 decibels. That's approaching the level of a busy restaurant or heavy traffic. The room had gotten very quiet. Patricia's face had turned a deep shade of red. You had no right to measure noise from other properties, she said. That's an invasion of privacy. Actually, measuring sound levels from my own property is completely legal. Sound that travels into public or semi-public spaces has no expectation of privacy. But that's beside the point. The point is that I'm being fined for violations I didn't commit, while actual noise disturbances are being ignored. Another board member, a woman named Carol, spoke up. Patricia, have we had any complaints about noise from your property? Of course not, Patricia snapped. This is ridiculous. Derek is clearly manufacturing this data to deflect from his own violations. I'm not manufacturing anything, I said. I'm happy to provide the raw data files, the user manual for the sound meter, and even have the device independently verified for accuracy. I'm also happy to set up continuous monitoring that the board can review. The board members looked at each other uncomfortably. The man who'd asked about the nighttime readings cleared his throat. I think we need to table this discussion and investigate further. We can't assess a fine without proper evidence. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but another board member, a younger man named Marcus, nodded in agreement. I agree. We should verify these measurements before proceeding. Fine, Patricia said tightly. The fine will remain in place pending investigation. Actually, Carol interjected, I think the fine should be suspended until we resolve this. We can't force a resident to pay for a violation we haven't definitively proven. After some back and forth, the board voted 3-2 to suspend the fine pending investigation. Patricia was visibly furious, but had no choice but to accept the vote. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic, but also knowing that Patricia wasn't going to let this go. I was right. 2 days later, I received a notice that I was being fined $200 for having my trash cans visible from the street outside of designated collection hours. The notice included a photo timestamp showing my cans at the curb at 7:30 in the morning. Trash collection in our neighborhood happened between 7 and 9 a.m. I put my cans out at 7:15, which was perfectly reasonable. The photo had been taken by Patricia herself. I documented the timestamp on the notice and took my own photos showing the trash truck on our street at 8:15 a.m. I submitted a formal complaint to the board about harassment. The next week, I got another notice. This one was for my front lawn being 1/4 inch above the permitted grass height of 3 inches. Patricia had apparently measured my lawn with a ruler. The fine was $100. I'd had enough. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Amanda Vasquez, and her office was in downtown Phoenix. When I explained the situation, she listened carefully and took notes. This is pretty clearly harassment, Amanda said. The pattern of behavior, the targeting with frivolous complaints, the use of her position to punish you for challenging her. It's textbook. What can I do about it? Well, you have a few options. You could continue fighting each fine individually, which is exhausting and exactly what she wants. You could try to get her removed from the board, but that requires a vote from the homeowners, which is difficult to organize. Or you could consider legal action. What kind of legal action? You could file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and abuse of authority. Given the evidence you have, you'd probably have a strong case, but litigation is expensive and time-consuming. I thought about it. What if she escalates further? That's a real possibility. In my experience, HOA board members who abuse their power don't stop until they're forced to. They see it as their neighborhood and their rules. I'm documenting everything, I said. The noise measurements, the frivolous fines, the timeline of events. I have emails, photos, the whole thing. Amanda nodded approvingly. That's smart. Keep doing that. And if she does escalate, we'll be ready. She escalated. The following week, I received a certified letter informing me that Patricia Henderson, acting as president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, was filing a small claims court action against me. The lawsuit sought $2,000 in damages for ongoing noise violations that she claimed had caused her emotional distress, sleep deprivation, and a hostile living environment. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. I called Amanda immediately. "They're suing you personally, not the HOA suing you?" she asked, sounding surprised. "The letter says Patricia Henderson versus Derek Johnson. It mentions the HOA and the alleged violations, but she's the plaintiff." "That's interesting. She's stepping outside her official capacity." "That actually works in your favor because it means she can't hide behind the HOA's legal protections. You'll need to file a response and prepare for small claims court." "I've never been to court before. Small claims is pretty informal. No lawyers, just you and her and a judge. You present your evidence, she presents hers, and the judge makes a ruling. Given what you've told me and the documentation you have, I'd say you have a very strong defense. In fact, you might want to consider filing a counterclaim." "For what?" "Harassment, defamation, abuse of process." "She's using the legal system to continue her pattern of targeting you. That's actionable." I spent the next few weeks preparing my case with Amanda's guidance. Even though she couldn't represent me in small claims court, she helped me organize my evidence and understand the legal standards I needed to meet. I created a presentation that included my sound level data, photos, timestamps, documentation of all the frivolous fines, and witness statements from neighbors who'd confirmed they'd never heard excessive noise from my property. I also did something else. I set up a security camera on my back patio with a clear view toward Patricia's townhouse. The camera had an audio recording feature, and I let it run every evening. The recordings were damning. Night after night, Patricia's television blared loudly enough to be clearly audible from my property. On several occasions, I could hear her shouting at her television, at what sounded like phone conversations, and once at someone who might have been inside her house with her. I had the audio files analyzed by a professional acoustic engineer, who provided a written report confirming that the sound levels coming from Patricia's property regularly exceeded acceptable residential noise standards, while the sound levels from my property remained within normal limits. The court date arrived on a Wednesday morning at the Maricopa County Justice Court. I showed up early with a briefcase full of evidence, my laptop, and a portable speaker to play the audio recordings. Patricia arrived a few minutes after me, dressed in a business suit and carrying her own folder of materials. We were called into the courtroom, which was smaller and less formal than I'd expected. The judge, A woman in her 50s named Judge Martinez sat at a raised desk and gestured for us to take our seats at opposite tables. "This is Henderson versus Johnson," Judge Martinez said, looking at her paperwork. "Miss Henderson, you're alleging noise violations and seeking damages." "Is that correct?" Patricia stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Johnson has been creating excessive noise from his property for months. Despite multiple complaints and warnings from the HOA, which I serve as president, he's refused to stop. The noise has been severe enough to interfere with my sleep and my ability to enjoy my own home. I'm seeking $2,000 in damages for the emotional distress and diminished quality of life I've experienced." "And what evidence do you have of these noise violations?" the judge asked. Patricia pulled out several pieces of paper. "I have my own testimony, as well as complaints filed with the HOA." "Are these complaints from you or from other residents?" Patricia hesitated. "The complaints are kept confidential, Your Honor, but they were properly documented through the HOA's official process." "That's not what I asked. Did you personally experience these noise disturbances?" "Yes, Your Honor. I live directly behind Mr. Johnson's property." "And did other residents also file complaints?" Another hesitation. "I received verbal complaints from other residents, but nothing in writing from anyone other than yourself." "Well, some people prefer not to create conflict in the neighborhood." Judge Martinez made a note. "All right. Mr. Johnson, what's your response?" I stood up and felt my heart racing but kept my voice steady. "Your Honor, the noise complaints against me are false. I've lived in my townhouse for 11 months and I maintain a quiet household. I work from home as a software developer, and my typical activities include reading, watching television at moderate volume, and occasionally playing video games with headphones. I don't have parties. I don't play loud music, and I'm very conscious of not disturbing my neighbors." "Do you have any evidence to support this?" "Yes, Your Honor, substantial evidence." I opened my briefcase and pulled out my materials. After I was accused of noise violations, I purchased a professional-grade sound level meter and documented the actual noise levels in my home over a period of several weeks. I set up my laptop and walked the judge through my data. I explained the measurements, the timestamps, and what the different decibel levels meant. I showed her that my typical sound levels were between 40 and 60 decibels, well below any reasonable noise threshold. Judge Martinez looked interested. "This is quite thorough, Miss Henderson. Do you have any response to this data?" Patricia stood up again. "Your Honor, he could have easily manipulated those readings. There's no way to verify that he was creating his usual level of noise when he took those measurements." "Actually, there is," I said. "The device has a continuous data logging function. It recorded sound levels every minute for 14 consecutive days. The raw data file shows timestamps for every single measurement. I'd be happy to provide the file for independent verification." I handed a USB drive to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. "I also have something else, Your Honor." I pulled out my portable speaker and connected it to my laptop. I installed a security camera with audio recording on my back patio because the harassment from Miss Henderson continued to escalate. The camera captured audio from the surrounding area, including Miss Henderson's property. Patricia's face went pale. "Your Honor, that's an invasion of privacy." "Audio recorded from a shared outdoor space where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy is perfectly legal," I said. "And what these recordings show is very relevant to this case." Judge Martinez nodded. "Let's hear them." I played a series of audio clips, each about 30 seconds long, taken from different evenings. The sound of Patricia's television was unmistakable and loud. You could clearly hear dialogue from what sounded like reality shows and game shows. In several clips, Patricia's voice was audible yelling at the television or having loud phone conversations. I had these audio files analyzed by a professional acoustic engineer, I said, handing his report to the clerk. His analysis confirms that the sound levels coming from Miss Henderson's property regularly exceeded 70 decibels, with peaks above 75. That's substantially higher than my property's noise levels and well above what's considered acceptable for a residential area during evening hours. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Judge Martinez looked at Patricia. Miss Henderson, do you have any response to this evidence? Patricia's hands were shaking slightly. Your Honor, what I do in my own home is my business. The issue here is Mr. Johnson's noise, not mine. Actually, Miss Henderson, the issue here is whether Mr. Johnson created noise disturbances that damaged you. His evidence suggests not only that he didn't, but that you may have been experiencing noise disturbances from your own property and mistakenly attributing them to his. That's absurd, Patricia said. I know the difference between my own television and noise coming from outside. Do you? Judge Martinez asked. Mr. Johnson, do you have any other evidence? Yes, Your Honor. I have written statements from multiple neighbors confirming that they've never heard excessive noise from my property. I handed over the statements. I also have documentation showing that, after I challenged the initial noise complaints, Miss Henderson began issuing multiple frivolous fines against me for minor or non-existent violations. I believe this lawsuit is part of a pattern of harassment. I provided copies of the fines for the trash cans and the lawn height, along with photos and timestamps proving they were unjustified. Judge Martinez reviewed the materials carefully. After several minutes, she looked up. Miss Henderson, I've reviewed all the evidence presented today. Mr. Johnson has provided extensive, credible documentation showing that his property noise levels are within normal residential limits. In contrast, you've provided no objective evidence of noise violations, only your own testimony. Furthermore, the audio recordings and acoustic analysis suggest that noise from your property significantly exceeds that from Mr. Johnson's property. Based on this evidence, I'm dismissing your claim with prejudice. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Additionally, Judge Martinez continued, the pattern of behavior documented here concerns me. As HOA president, you have a duty to act fairly and in good faith. Using your position to harass a resident who challenged your authority is an abuse of that position. While this court doesn't have jurisdiction over HOA internal matters, I strongly suggest that the HOA board review Ms. Henderson's actions. The judge turned to me. Mr. Johnson, you mentioned considering a counterclaim. Do you wish to pursue that? I'd thought about this moment. Part of me wanted to, but another part just wanted this whole thing to be over. Your Honor, if Miss Henderson agrees to stop the harassment, withdraw all pending fines against me, and resign from the HOA board, I'm willing to forego the counterclaim. Judge Martinez looked at Patricia. Miss Henderson. Patricia stood there, her face red, her hands gripping the table. For a moment, I thought she was going to refuse, but then something in her seemed to deflate. Fine, she said quietly. I need you to be clear, Judge Martinez said. You agree to withdraw all pending fines against Mr. Johnson and to resign from your position as HOA president. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. I'm ordering that agreement as part of today's ruling. Miss Henderson, you have 30 days to comply. If you fail to do so, Mr. Johnson may bring the matter back before this court. Case dismissed. We were ushered out of the courtroom. Patricia walked past me without making eye contact and left the building quickly. I stood in the hallway for a moment, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Over the next few weeks, things settled down considerably. Patricia did, in fact, resign from the HOA board. The resignation letter was brief and didn't give any specific reasons, but everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened. The court proceedings were public record, and word spreads quickly in a homeowners association. All the fines against me were formally withdrawn. I received a letter from the new interim HOA president, Marcus, apologizing for the situation and assuring me that the board would be reviewing their complaint procedures to prevent similar issues in the future. I ran into Frank one afternoon while checking my mail. "I heard about what happened with Patricia," he said. "Good for you for standing up to her. That took guts." "I just wanted to be left alone," I said, "but I wasn't going to let her steamroll me with false accusations. A lot of people around here tried to tell her she was overstepping, but she never listened. Maybe this will teach her something." I doubted that, but I didn't say so. About 2 months after the court case, I saw a moving truck outside Patricia's townhouse. I watched from my window as furniture and boxes were loaded up. Patricia appeared briefly to direct the movers, but she didn't look in the direction of my property. By evening, the truck was gone and her townhouse was empty. A week later, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of her place. The new owners who eventually moved in were a couple in their 30s with 2 young kids. They introduced themselves one Saturday morning as I was leaving for a grocery run. Their names were Tom and Lisa, and they seemed friendly and laid back. "We heard there was some drama with the previous owner," Lisa said with an apologetic smile. "We just want you to know we're not like that. We believe in being good neighbors." "I appreciate that," I said, "and welcome to the neighborhood." Life in Meadowbrook Hills returned to normal. The HOA held elections a few months later, and Marcus was officially voted in as the new president. Under his leadership, the board implemented new policies requiring objective evidence for any complaints and creating an appeals process for residents who felt they'd been unfairly targeted. I kept my sound meter, though I didn't need to use it anymore. It sat on a shelf in my office as a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. Sometimes people in positions of power, even small positions in neighborhood associations, will abuse that power if they think they can get away with it. Documentation, evidence, and a willingness to defend yourself can make all the difference. One evening about 6 months after the whole ordeal, I was sitting on my back patio enjoying the sunset. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. I could hear children playing a few houses down, someone's wind chimes tinkling softly in the breeze, and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. It was all perfectly normal, pleasant ambient noise. Tom from next door called over the fence. "Hey Derek, we're having a little barbecue tomorrow evening. Nothing crazy, just a few neighbors. You want to come by?" "Sure," I said. "What can I bring? Just yourself?" "We're trying to get to know people in the neighborhood, build some community." "Sounds good." "What time?" "Around 6. We should wrap up by 9 or so. We try to be considerate about noise since we've got the kids and all." I smiled. "I appreciate that, but don't worry too much. A little noise from people having a good time never hurt anyone." The next evening, I went to the barbecue. There were about a dozen people there, including Frank and several other neighbors I'd gotten to know over the past year. The food was good, the conversation was easy, and the atmosphere was relaxed. Someone had brought a speaker and was playing music at a reasonable volume. Kids ran around the yard playing tag while the adults stood around talking. At one point, Jennifer, the neighbor who'd told me about Patricia's garden gnome fine, came up to me with a beer in hand. "I'm really glad you fought back against Patricia," she said. A lot of us wanted to, but we were scared of becoming targets. After what happened with you, several people filed complaints about how she was running the HOA. It helped push the board to make changes. I didn't do it to be a hero, I said. I just couldn't let her get away with making false accusations. Still, it mattered. The neighborhood's a lot more pleasant now. Marcus actually listens to people and tries to be reasonable. That's all we ever wanted. As the evening wound down and I walked back to my townhouse, I reflected on everything that had happened. The stress, the frustration, the time and money spent fighting Patricia's accusations. It had been exhausting, but it had also been necessary. Living in an HOA meant accepting certain rules and restrictions. That was part of the deal when I bought my place. But it didn't mean surrendering to unreasonable demands or accepting punishment for things I didn't do. The system worked when both sides acted in good faith. When someone abused their authority, the only option was to push back with facts and evidence. My decibel meter had been the key. Without that objective data, it would have been my word against Patricia's. And as HOA president, she had institutional authority on her side. But numbers don't lie. The measurements proved definitively that I wasn't creating noise disturbances, and ironically, that she was the actual source of excessive noise. I'd learned a lot through the experience. I learned about sound measurement, HOA law, small claims court procedures, and the importance of documentation. But more than that, I learned that standing up for yourself, even against someone in authority, was possible if you had the evidence and the determination to see it through. The story made the rounds at neighborhood gatherings for months afterward. New residents would hear about that time the HOA president sued someone for noise, and it totally backfired. It became part of the neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale about abuse of power and the importance of evidence-based decision-making. Marcus, the new HOA president, actually referenced the situation at one of the board meetings I attended a year later. He was discussing proposed changes to the complaint process. "We need to remember what happened with the noise complaint situation last year," he told the assembled residents. Someone was almost fined and taken to court based on accusations that turned out to be false. That never should have happened. Going forward, we need to require some level of objective verification before we take action against a resident. That protects everyone. The new policies required that any noise complaint be verified by at least 2 separate residents on different occasions. The HOA would also offer to provide sound level meters to residents who wanted to document issues objectively. Fines couldn't be assessed until there was clear evidence of a violation, and all residents had the right to appeal any decision to the full board. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was significantly better than what had existed under Patricia's leadership. I occasionally wondered what happened to Patricia after she moved away. I assumed she'd found another neighborhood to live in, hopefully one where she'd learned to be a better neighbor. Or maybe she'd found another HOA board to join and was up to her old tricks elsewhere. I'd never know, and honestly, I didn't care. She was no longer my problem. Life settled into a comfortable routine. My work was going well. I'd made actual friends in the neighborhood, and I could enjoy my evenings without worrying about being accused of imaginary violations. The simple pleasure of sitting in my living room watching television without anxiety was something I'd learned not to take for granted. Frank and I developed a friendly relationship, occasionally chatting when we saw each other outside or sharing a beer on the weekend. He told me stories about the neighborhood's history, the various characters who'd lived there over the years, and the evolution of the HOA from a casual neighborhood association to the more formalized structure it had become. "Patricia wasn't the first power-hungry board member we've had," he said one afternoon. But she was definitely the worst. Most people get on the board because they actually want to help maintain property values and keep the neighborhood nice. But every once in a while, you get someone who just likes having authority over other people. Those are the dangerous ones. What made her so bad? I asked. She genuinely believed she was entitled to tell everyone how to live. In her mind, the HOA rules weren't guidelines for community living, they were her personal code of law, and she was the enforcer. And if you challenged her, you became an enemy who needed to be defeated. That's a pretty toxic mindset. It is. And the scary thing is, she probably still thinks she was right and you were the problem. People like that rarely engage in self-reflection. He was probably right, but that was okay. I didn't need Patricia to acknowledge she'd been wrong. The judge had done that for me. The evidence had done that. And the fact that she'd been forced to resign and eventually moved away was validation enough. As time passed, the whole incident began to feel less significant. It became just one chapter in my life, something that happened and was resolved. I stopped thinking about it daily, then weekly, then barely at all. The decibel meter remained on my shelf, unused but kept as a memento. About 2 years after everything happened, I was at a neighborhood HOA meeting where we were discussing approving funds for new landscaping at the community entrance. It was a boring, routine meeting, exactly the kind of thing HOA meetings should be. No drama, no accusations, just neighbors making collective decisions about shared spaces. During a break, a newer resident named Sarah approached me. She'd moved in about 6 months earlier and was serving on the grounds committee. "You're Derek Johnson, right?" she asked. "That's me." I heard about what happened with the previous HOA president. That took real courage to stand up to her like that. I shrugged. I just did what I had to do. She was making false accusations, and I had the evidence to prove it. Still, a lot of people would have just paid the fines to avoid the hassle. The fact that you fought it changed things around here for the better. I'm glad it worked out that way, but honestly, I was just trying to defend myself. Sarah smiled. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one person standing up sets an example for everyone else. After the meeting ended and I walked home under the streetlights, I thought about what Sarah had said. I didn't think of myself as particularly courageous or heroic. I'd been backed into a corner and had fought my way out using the tools available to me: logic, evidence, and the legal system. Anyone in my position would have done the same, but maybe that was the point. Maybe courage wasn't about doing something extraordinary. Maybe it was about refusing to accept injustice when it happened to you, even when fighting back was inconvenient or uncomfortable. Maybe it was about trusting that the system, imperfect as it was, could work if you engaged with it properly. The night was quiet as I reached my townhouse. I could hear the soft murmur of televisions from nearby homes, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of palm trees in the warm Arizona breeze. It was all perfectly normal, the ambient sound of people living their lives. I went inside, made myself a late dinner, and settled onto my couch with a book. The television stayed off. The house was quiet except for the occasional turn of a page and the soft hum of the air conditioning. If someone had been measuring the sound level, it probably would have registered around 35 decibels. Peaceful, unremarkable, exactly how it should be. The irony wasn't lost on me that the whole ordeal had started because Patricia accused me of being too loud, when in reality, I was one of the quietest residents in the neighborhood. Her accusations said more about her than they ever said about me. They revealed someone who was quick to blame others, who assumed the worst in people, and who wielded her authority as a weapon rather than a responsibility. I'd encountered people like that before in various contexts: managers at work who micromanaged their teams, teachers who seemed to enjoy failing students, customer service representatives who treated every inquiry as a personal attack, people who let small amounts of power go to their heads and used it to make others miserable. The difference was that this time, I'd had the resources and the evidence to fight back effectively. Not everyone in Patricia's crosshairs had been so fortunate. I thought about Jennifer and her garden gnome fine, about the other neighbors who'd mentioned being targeted for minor infractions, about all the people who just paid the fines to avoid the hassle. That was how petty tyrants maintained their power, by making it more painful to fight than to submit. They counted on people being too busy, too tired, or too intimidated to challenge them. And most of the time, that strategy worked, but not always. Not when someone decided that enough was enough and put in the work to build a case. Not when someone decided that principles mattered more than convenience. I thought about the decibel meter sitting on my office shelf and smiled. That $200 device had been the best investment I'd made since moving to Meadowbrook Hills. It had given me objective truth in a situation built on subjective accusations. It had transformed, he said, she said dispute into a simple question of data. And data, properly collected and presented, was irrefutable. The experience had taught me something valuable about living in a community governed by an HOA. The rules and restrictions could be frustrating, but they also provided a framework for resolving disputes. The key was holding everyone, especially those in authority, accountable to those rules. When board members acted fairly and in good faith, the system worked reasonably well. When they abused their power, residents had recourse through appeals, board elections, and ultimately the legal system. Patricia had forgotten that. She'd assumed her position as president gave her unlimited authority to act on her personal grievances. She'd learned, the hard way, that it didn't. I finished my chapter and set the book aside. Tomorrow was a workday, and I needed to get some sleep. As I went through my nighttime routine, brushing teeth, setting the alarm, checking that the doors were locked, I felt a sense of contentment that had been absent during those stressful months of dealing with Patricia's harassment. My home was my sanctuary again. I could live my life without walking on eggshells, without worrying that some trivial action would result in a fine or a complaint. I could just be. That was all I'd ever wanted. To live quietly in my townhouse, do my work, pursue my hobbies, and be a decent neighbor. The fact that I'd had to go to court to preserve that simple right seemed absurd in retrospect. But that was the reality of dealing with someone who'd let power corrupt their judgment. As I lay in bed waiting for sleep, I heard a faint sound through the wall. Frank's television, playing at a barely audible level. It didn't bother me at all. It was just the normal sound of someone winding down their evening, watching the news or a late-night show. That was the thing about reasonable people. They produced reasonable amounts of noise, and they tolerated reasonable amounts of noise from others. They understood that living in close proximity to other humans meant accepting a certain level of ambient sound. They didn't weaponize every little disturbance or use complaints as a form of control. I drifted off to sleep thinking about how much better the neighborhood had become since Patricia left. The new energy was collaborative rather than confrontational. People looked out for each other without constantly policing each other. The HOA functioned as it was meant to, maintaining common areas and property values without becoming an oppressive force in residents' daily lives. The months continued to pass, and life remained pleasantly uneventful. I got a promotion at work that came with a significant raise. I used some of the extra money to upgrade my home office setup and to take a nice vacation to Colorado. I dated casually, though nothing serious developed. I volunteered for one of the HOA committees, figuring that being part of the process was better than just complaining about it. Marcus proved to be an excellent HOA president. He was organized, fair-minded, and genuinely interested in serving the community rather than ruling over it. Under his leadership, the neighborhood completed several improvement projects, including repaving the main roads, upgrading the community center, and adding new playground equipment in the common area. The board meetings became productive rather than contentious. Decisions were made through discussion and consensus rather than dictated by a single person. When disputes arose between neighbors, the board mediated rather than immediately assigning blame and issuing fines. It was remarkable how much difference leadership made. The same set of rules, the same neighborhood, the same residents, but completely different outcomes based on who was making the decisions. I ran into Lisa, Tom's wife, at the community center one day. Their kids were playing on the new playground while we sat on a bench watching them. "I'm so glad we moved here," she said. "Everyone's been so welcoming. It really feels like a community." "It's a good neighborhood," I agreed. "It took a little while to get here, but yeah, it's a good place to live." Tom and I were worried when we heard about the drama with the previous HOA president. We almost didn't put in an offer on the house because of it. But our realtor said things had changed significantly, and she was right. "Sometimes it takes a shake-up to improve things," I said. "The neighborhood's better off now." Lisa's daughter ran up asking for a snack, and our conversation ended. But as I walked home afterward, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that my decision to fight Patricia's accusations had contributed to creating a better environment for everyone. It hadn't been my intention, I'd just been defending myself, but the ripple effects had been positive. That evening, I pulled the decibel meter off the shelf and looked at it. The device was sleek and professional, with its digital display and various buttons for different measurement modes. It seemed like such a simple tool, but it had been the key to everything. I wondered if I should donate it to the HOA now that they were offering to provide sound meters to residents with noise concerns. But then, I decided to keep it. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it represented something important. It represented the power of objective evidence, the importance of standing up for yourself, and the difference one person could make by refusing to accept injustice. I put it back on the shelf and went about my evening. 3 years after the court case, the neighborhood held a community appreciation event. It was Marcus's idea, a casual gathering to celebrate the improvements that had been made and to recognize residents who'd contributed to the community. I almost didn't go. These kinds of events weren't really my thing, but several neighbors encouraged me, so I figured I'd make an appearance. The event was held on a Saturday afternoon in the common area. There were tables with food, games for kids, and a small stage where Marcus gave a brief speech about the state of the neighborhood. To my surprise, he called me up to the stage. "I want to recognize Derek Johnson," Marcus said as I reluctantly walked up. A few years ago, Derek found himself in a difficult situation. Rather than backing down or accepting an unjust accusation, he stood his ground and demanded accountability. His actions led to important changes in how our HOA operates and reminded all of us that leadership means serving the community, not controlling it. "Derek, thank you for your courage and for helping make Meadowbrook Hills a better place to live." People applauded, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, but I appreciated the recognition. Marcus handed me a plaque with a generic community appreciation message, and I returned to my seat as quickly as possible. Later, as the event was winding down, Frank found me near the food table. "That was well deserved," he said. "What you did mattered." "I was just trying to avoid paying $500 for something I didn't do," I said with a laugh. "Maybe. But sometimes doing the right thing for selfish reasons still counts as doing the right thing." We stood there for a moment watching the neighbors pack up their things and corral their kids. The sun was setting, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful evening in a peaceful neighborhood. "You know what the best part is," Frank said. "Most of the people here today have no idea what happened with Patricia. The new families, the renters, they just know this as a nice place to live. That's how it should be." He was right. The drama had faded into history, remembered by those who'd experienced it but irrelevant to those who hadn't. The neighborhood had moved on, improved, and become what it was always meant to be, just a place where people lived their lives. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the entire journey from Patricia's first knock on my door to this moment of community recognition. It had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. There had been moments when I'd questioned whether fighting was worth it or if I should just pay the fines and try to fly under the radar. But looking back, I knew I'd made the right choice, not just for myself, but for everyone who came after me. The changes to the HOA policies, the shift in leadership culture, the improved sense of community, all of it could be traced back to that decision to demand evidence rather than accept baseless accusations. That night, I slept better than I had in years, knowing that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just change your situation, it changes things for everyone around you. And all it took was a $200 decibel meter and the willingness to use it.